Okay, so we have covered hardware. We've covered the two most popular simulator programs out there. Let's talk about what you can do with the simulator once you've got it built and ready to go at home. So a couple things I like to highlight. We're going to do failures and live weather, and we're going to compare Microsoft versus X-Plane, and then we'll jump into scenarios that work great in either program. So starting off with failures from Microsoft Flight Simulator, once we have our aircraft chosen, you'll see failures on the far left tab. We can choose those, and it's going to give us about 7 or 8 failures for the Cessna 172 that we can pre-program. So we can see a complete failure of the engine. We can see an oil system failure, oil leak, fuel pump. There's also a fire issue, things of that sort. You can choose to turn them on, to arm them, and then put a window of will start at least 8 minutes and will absolutely happen within 10 minutes. So a window of 2 minutes there. You can pre-program those into the simulator and practice those scenarios. It's okay, but it's not great. X-Plane 12 really gets into what you can do with failures, and that's one of the reasons I like to recommend it again, is if you want to work on those or work on your checklists, X-Plane 12 gives you some more options here. So here we are on the Cessna 172 page. You'll see failures in the bottom tab. By clicking that, we now have an overview of what categories we have in front of us. We can choose a category, get into some of the subcategories. Here we have instruments, we have engine. Now I like to point out, we're not going to set a failure for the engine. We're going to set a failure for engine instruments in the aircraft. So that very challenging scenario where your aircraft is doing one thing, but the panel says another. You have the ability to pre-program those for X-Plane 12. If we get into engine instruments, you'll see we can change the RPM settings. We can fault a couple of the other really granular things here. And each one of those, we have the option to set as failed from the get-go, failed when 2 keys are pressed, failed when we hit a certain altitude, when we hit a certain speed, a mean setting, all these things to really make it a random event rather than something we anticipate, and gives us a lot of abilities there. Another thing worth pointing out is if you look at the bottom, you're going to see there's the option to set a time between failures. Now with the Cessna 172, we've got about 572 options of what can fail. And look at that number you put in the white box as how long it's going to take for all those failures to happen. So if we want all the failures to happen in 2 hours, we're going to get, based off this scenario, about 280-ish failures per hour to hit that 500 plus version. If we want to get closer to real life thing and say 200 hours, we expect everything to happen, you're going to have only a couple per hour. If you want to take it up to it's a brand new aircraft, I want everything to happen in 10,000 hours. You have that ability to really randomize it and make it something that will challenge you, but also not be keeping you behind the airplane, if you will. But if you ever do want to get to that point where all you're doing is putting out fires, you could set it for 1 hour and have 572 failures within that 1 hour. That is not going to be a fun day, but it's going to challenge you. Let's move into live weather. Microsoft Flight Sim. As you are on the world map page, you've picked up your aircraft, you've picked up your location, you'll see in the weather or flight conditions page, we can get into all those granular details on the right half of the page, the time of the year, the time of the day, winds, clouds, all the above. And then on the left side, we have multiplayer, we have air traffic, and then we have weather and time, which is currently set to custom. If we take that to the live button, we no longer have control of what the weather outside is going to be in our simulator. It's pre-programmed, it's set. So when I did this yesterday, I went ahead and jumped in the aircraft. It was a pretty marginal day. And as you can see, based off what ForeFlight or the METAR here at Sporty's was telling us, it's not looking too great. So this is a nice way to go ahead and auto-populate those settings into your program, and it works quite well in Microsoft Flight Simulator. In regards to X-Plane 12, I kind of covered it a little bit earlier. From the aircraft selection page, we go to the weather tab. We go ahead and click here, and then we populate the active weather I did the same test yesterday right after Microsoft's version. Here, as you can see, we've got some wind layers. We also have some really bad clouds. And if I click on those, it'll give me the details of AGL, the heights, the ceilings, the bases, all the above, and really gets into what we can expect in our digital world. So live weather is a great feature for both Microsoft and X-Plane to get out and fly in those scenarios where you wouldn't do it in real life. Let's talk about some VFR maneuvers. And again, from here on out, when it comes to scenarios, these apply to both programs. That's the way to look at it. What are some VFR maneuvers we like to fly? Before I get into those, I like to highlight what we call the 10-foot rule. And what I mean by this is whatever happens within 10 feet of the runway is not going to be extremely accurate to what happens in real life. I like to highlight that a flare in a Cessna 172 in programs is not going to be accurate to what happens in a real Cessna 172. Being cognizant of that and being aware of it is helpful. Don't get me wrong, you can go practice those, but I don't want you to think, hey, I just greased 20 landings in a row in a Cessna 172 and X-Plane, I can go do the same thing in real life. They do not translate. So it's the rule of 10 feet. Also, taxiing in flight simulators. I do not know why, but it is always more difficult to taxi in X-Plane or Microsoft Flight Sim than what I experienced in 172. So again, that applies to that rule of 10. But everything above that, I like to highlight is a great training atmosphere for a simulator. So let's move on past the rule of 10. What else can you do with it? I like to highlight checklist practice. I was one of those students that put the map you see or the poster you see right there on my wall, and I ran through scenarios. Engine just went out. What do I do to try and restart it? Or the whole panel just went dark. What am I doing electrically? Now we have the ability to run through those scenarios and see what the reactions are in a simulator rather than just assuming it in our brain. I think that's something unique and something you can easily do with a simulator. We also have power on stalls. This was a scenario that when I did my training, it was guaranteed I'd get out of the aircraft with a sweaty shirt because it was stressful to me. Well, doing it in a simulator helps you understand how to have rudder control, how to pitch, how to recover, all the above, and is just one of maybe 30 great VFR maneuvers I like to recommend. Another one is VFR into IFR. This is a scenario that I don't think any pilot should necessarily practice in real life until they're instrument current or have a very good instrument understanding. So to do that in a simulator where you're flying along, it's a beautiful VFR day, and then all of a sudden a layer comes out of nowhere and you can't see the ground anymore. What do you do? The simulator is a great way to show you how you should approach it, how you should fix the problem, and then that way you have a better understanding if you ever find yourself in it in real life. And then another one is the short field approach and landing over an obstacle. This is a great way to better understand coming in at certain speeds with a certain headwind, how much runway does that 172 need to cover a 50-foot obstacle? Now, I'm not saying you can do it on a field that's 2,000 feet long and therefore you're eligible to fly anywhere in that situation, but it is helpful to know once you've cleared the obstacle, how does the next transition of the phase work? What do you do as you're landing? All the above, and get a better understanding of what your aircraft at certain density altitudes can do and how much runway you necessarily need. All right, so that was VFR. Let's get into instrument flying, which is, I think, one of the best takeaways a simulator can offer. I'm going to mention that when flying instrument in a simulator, it is absolutely worth connecting it to either ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot, whatever EFB you use. It's really good to have them working in tandem and better understand how your electronic flight bag operates as you fly in the simulator. Great way to better understand new features on that EFB, but also a great way to work alongside as you're flying the aircraft in challenging scenarios. We have a blog covering how to connect aviation apps with your home flight simulator, and it's worth reviewing if you do find yourself with an EFB and an at-home simulator. One of the things I'd point out in instrument flying is en route flying. Yes, this is not the most fun. It's not going to be the most appealing, but it is something to build up your tolerance in instrument flying. Here we are just flying around, no reference to the ground, but we're getting a better understanding of our avionics. We're getting a better understanding of our aircraft at altitudes. And we also have the chance of those slanted cloud layers or other scenarios that our view tells us one thing, but the aircraft tells us another. I think it's worth practicing in route flying just so you're not taking the outside edges of a flight's profile. In route flying is there. And let's say, hey, this isn't challenging to you anymore. You can keep the airplane straight and level. Well, go ahead and throw yourself into an actual serious IFR situation. And I promise you, it will take a little bit of your energy. Go fly just based off instruments in the real muck in a simulator. And after a good hour flight, push away from the desk. And I assure you, you're going to feel a little more tired than when you started because you are doing that scan. You're focusing on instruments. You're hopefully working the radios, your avionics. It's a good way to strengthen that muscle of instrument flying in a simulator so that you don't have to do it in a real aircraft where you're paying a lot of money per hour. I also like to highlight course tracking. This is a way you can critique how to hold the CDI centered. For VOR basics, it was an aha moment for me once I realized that independent of where my aircraft was headed, that VOR needle was going to be at the same location, a to and a from on there. For instance, in that image we have in front of us, if that aircraft was flying southwest, but was at that exact same point, the CDI would indicate the exact same thing. It is independent of your heading. And when I realized that, I was paying a lot of money while flying an aircraft. Well, you can go do that in a simulator and get a better understanding of not just the VOR basics, but also flying a GPS, flying a localizer, things of that sort, and how you are able to use your CDIs to complement your course in a simulator. We can also work on those departures. So we can go ahead and simulate the 0-0 takeoff, where you're just keeping that center line in front of you, using your rudder pedals until it's transitioned to flare speed and taken off. This is always a challenging maneuver and one I like to practice every once in a while, just to make sure if I'm ever there, I'm ready to go. And then of course you can throw departure plates on here and really get into what's expected as you transition up to the majors in aviation. I don't know how often, whether it's in a 172, whether it's in a Cessna Citation, you're going to be using the full departure paths, but it is good to know how they operate, what they require, what they mean, and you can do all this in the simulator. Arrivals, let's look at the other side of that coin. A nice way to transition from en route to I'm coming into the airport, what is the recommended path? Now these usually apply to aircraft that are at those higher levels, the higher flight levels, things of that sort. Maybe not for a Cessna 172, but either way, still a good thing to review every once in a while. And then instrument flying approaches. I put a couple exclamation marks here because this is one of the other big takeaways a simulator can offer. You can go fly approaches as much as you like, as quickly as you like, and critique certain scenarios and better understanding of those approaches at home, controlled, safe environment. Let's say you're going on a cross country and you're flying into a new airport and weather, it's not going to be perfect. It could be marginal that day, but it's well within your abilities. Go fly a couple of the scenarios coming into that airport and you will be better prepared for the verbiage, for when to turn, for the heading changes, all the above with a simulator. So if you can't tell, I'm pretty on board for using approaches in a flight simulator. A couple of these we can look at is you can go fly the old and close to being outdated NDB approach. There's still a few out there. You can go practice them yourself. We can also go fly the DME arc, keeping your distance from the VOR or the VORTAC constant. It's a fun maneuver and one I've done quite a few things in the simulator and then a couple times in real life. The one I fly the most often is the ILS approach, keeping your localizer and your glide slope as a target on CDI1 is a step towards a game for me but it's also realistic to what we do in the aircraft and better understanding of those minor changes you make to keep you right on center. We also have RNAV or GPS approaches, which are going to be a lot of the approaches, if not all the approaches in the future. We can practice some visual approaches. So, I'm taking a step back from instrument flying here, but there are visual approaches out there. I wanted to choose a fun one. This is an actual approach into Boston that uses lighthouses and then also an old fort, Fort Warren, as your cues for when you make changes. So I went ahead and I took that approach. I applied it on to ForeFlight and I flew this maneuver in a 172. So here we have, you can see my track. You can see as I was getting ready to turn inbound for landing on runway 33 left, and you'll see that off to my left is Fort Warren, so I should be able to see that outside the aircraft, right? Well, looking outside, there it is. I can go ahead and make that turn inbound. This is no longer the days of things that the program doesn't focus on for approaches. It had no idea I was going to do this approach this day, but yet it had wherewithal to make sure that was noticeable, and it allows us to really jump in any approach, any flight, and we'll get applicable views. Here's one outside the aircraft also, and that was in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So approaches are a really great takeaway and something I like to highlight. Let's jump into one approach. This is the Lunken ILS approach. I fly a lot here at Sporty's. It's only about 10 nautical miles away from Sporty's airport, and one I quickly practice. For this one, I was taking vectors to final. I turned in right before one of the initial approach fixes, so I came in at 3,000, quickly descended down to 2,000, and then was intercepting the glide slope. So here's my track log. Here is a closer view. And again, that's another thing that we really take away is we can critique and edit our approaches here. Here is the profile view on the bottom half of the screen showing my altitude versus my airspeed at different phases of the flight. So we can find out if once we intercepted that glide slope, did we hold a consistent approach speed or do we come down too quickly? It's really a great way to go through, find out how you flew the approach, what you would do differently, and in theory on following approaches, help to critique it. Here I am at about 1,100 feet at 90 knots approach speed. By any chance, does anyone remember what the minimum heights were for Lunken? Now, again, I briefly showed it, so I doubt anyone would know unless you've flown there, but those are 798 feet for the ILS 2-1 left. So I'm only a couple hundred feet above. And here is another look at, as I flew this approach, here I am at about 880. So I'm only about 100 feet above the missed approach point, and I can just start to see that running rabbit. I can see the runway indicator lights. So I'm committing to this approach. The reason I like to highlight this is we can go ahead and critique that weather. We can take those clouds, bring them down to our absolute limits, and put us in a scenario where we might have to go around or we're just about at it, which, as we all know as instrument pilots, that's where the sweat really starts to flow. All right, so that is instrument flying. Let's talk about a couple quick unlikely scenarios, and I apologize, I am running a bit over time, but there's a lot to cover here. Unlikely scenarios, ice on wing. We can go ahead and fly that and see how our aerodynamics degrade in that situation, and also we gain a lot of weight. We can test our service ceiling. Take a 172 up to 14,000 feet and see how it operates. How's the mixture working at that altitude? Full power, what can I get? Here, we're going to jump in a DA62. I like to highlight that this aircraft has a service ceiling of 20,000 feet, but then if you lose an engine, your single engine service ceiling comes down to 11. That's quite a bit. And maybe that's not going to be a problem here in the Midwest, but if you go out west, and let's say you're flying from the south side of Denver and you're heading on over to see a few friends at Eagle County Regional, only 100 miles away. What if we're in about a third of the way into this flight and we lose an engine? And we were cruising at 18,000 feet and now we're slowly descending to 11, which requires that operating engine at full power, perfect scenario, completely trimmed out aircraft. We might even drop down to 10. As I look along this route, I see some peaks at 14,000. I see one 14.8. I see a lot of things that conflict with our absolute ceiling here, or service ceiling. So it's worth putting yourself in a scenario like this where you may want to fly to the northwest towards that other airport, and then once you're over it, head to the southwest back to Eagle County Regional. You may want to turn around. Again, there's no decision to make for me that I can say is right, but these are the scenarios where it challenges us to think on the whim, to analyze and make that decision in a bad situation and become better pilots.